Venezuela shouldn't exist as a functioning country. Looking at the map, I can see exactly why it's collapsing, and why that collapse is accelerating beyond anyone's ability to control. This isn't a story about socialism versus capitalism, or authoritarian mismanagement versus democratic governance. Those are symptoms, not causes. This is a story about what happens when you try to build a modern nation-state in a place where geography makes centralized control nearly impossible, and oil wealth makes economic diversification unnecessary. The Venezuelan collapse isn't a political failure that can be fixed with better policies or leadership changes. It's a geographic inevitability that's been decades in the making, and we're finally watching it reach its logical conclusion. Let me walk you through why Venezuela was always doomed, and why what's happening now is just gravity finally asserting itself. Venezuela is essentially three different countries accidentally stuck together by colonial administrative boundaries. You've got the Caribbean coastal strip, where most people live, the Andean highlands that connect to Colombia, and the vast Amazon basin that connects to nothing useful. These regions don't naturally trade with each other, don't have complementary economies, and don't share transportation networks that make economic integration feasible. The only thing holding this geographic mess together for the past century has been oil money flowing from the eastern oil fields to Caracas, then getting redistributed through patronage networks to keep the various regions minimally functional. Take away that oil money, or more accurately, take away the ability to efficiently extract and export that oil, and there's no economic logic holding the country together. That's exactly what's happening now. Venezuelan oil production has collapsed from over 3 million barrels per day in the late 1990s to somewhere around 400,000 barrels per day today. That's not just economic mismanagement, though there's plenty of that. It's the result of geographic realities finally overwhelming political attempts to maintain a unified state. The Venezuelan oil industry was always artificially complex because of the country's geography. Most of the oil is in the eastern Orinoco Basin, but the refining capacity is scattered around the coast, and the export terminals are in completely different locations. This worked fine when you had the technical expertise, infrastructure investment, and international partnerships necessary to maintain a sophisticated supply chain across difficult terrain. But maintaining that kind of complex system requires institutional continuity and technical expertise that Venezuela lost when it decided to treat oil wealth as a political resource rather than an industrial asset. When you fire competent engineers for political reasons and replace them with party loyalists, when you stop investing in maintenance because you need the money for social programs, when you alienate international partners because ideology matters more than technical cooperation, the whole system breaks down. And once it breaks down, geography makes it nearly impossible to rebuild. The Orinoco Basin isn't connected to population centers by easy transportation routes. The refining facilities are isolated from each other and from export terminals. The pipeline networks cross terrain that's either mountainous, swampy, or controlled by groups that don't answer to Caracas. This is what happens when your economy depends on infrastructure that's more complex than your political system can maintain. The oil didn't disappear, it's still there in the ground, but the ability to extract, process, and export it in economically viable quantities requires a level of technical sophistication and institutional coordination that contemporary Venezuela simply doesn't possess. The human cost of this economic collapse is staggering, and it's creating refugee flows that are destabilizing the entire northern half of South America. Over 7 million Venezuelans have fled the country in the past decade. That's about a quarter of the population. They're not leaving because of political persecution, though that's certainly part of it. They're leaving because the country can no longer provide basic services like electricity, running water, medical care, or food distribution. Colombian border cities are overwhelmed with Venezuelan refugees who have no intention of returning. Peru, Ecuador, and Brazil are dealing with massive population influxes that their own infrastructure can't handle. Panama is seeing Venezuelan migrants attempting to cross the Darien Gap, one of the most dangerous stretches of terrain in the Americas, because they're desperate enough to risk death rather than stay in Venezuela. This refugee crisis isn't temporary, and it's not something that can be resolved through humanitarian aid or international assistance programs. These people are fleeing a country where the basic infrastructure of modern civilization has broken down and can't be rebuilt under current political and economic conditions. The demographics of this exodus make the situation even more catastrophic for Venezuela's long-term prospects. The people leaving aren't random. They're the ones with enough education, skills, or resources to make international migration feasible. Venezuela is losing its professional class, its technical workforce, and its entrepreneurial population, while retaining the people who are most dependent on government services and least capable of economic productivity. This creates a death spiral that's impossible to reverse through conventional political or economic reforms. As productive people leave, the tax base shrinks, which reduces government capacity to provide services, which creates incentives for more productive people to leave. Meanwhile, the people who remain become increasingly dependent on a state that has fewer and fewer resources to redistribute. The international community is pretending there are diplomatic solutions to this crisis, but geography makes meaningful intervention nearly impossible. Venezuela is protected by the Andes to the west, the Amazon to the south, and the Caribbean to the north. There's no easy way for outside powers to project meaningful influence into the Venezuelan heartland, and there's no obvious route for shipping humanitarian aid or economic assistance to the people who need it most. The United States has been sanctioning Venezuelan oil exports for years, which has accelerated the economic collapse but hasn't produced any meaningful political change. That's because sanctions work by imposing economic costs that force political compromises. But Venezuela's political system isn't capable of making rational economic calculations anymore. When your economy has already collapsed and your political survival depends on controlling what's left rather than rebuilding what's been lost, additional economic pressure doesn't create incentives for reform. China and Russia have provided some financial assistance, but they're not interested in rebuilding Venezuelan state capacity. They want access to oil resources and geopolitical influence in the Western Hemisphere. Neither of those objectives requires Venezuela to function as a coherent state. They just require access to specific geographic resources and the ability to complicate American regional influence. The result is that Venezuela is becoming a failed state with outside patrons rather than a functioning country with international partners. The Chinese get oil concessions, the Russians get military base rights, and the Venezuelan political elite gets enough external support to maintain power over the population that hasn't fled yet. But nobody's investing in the kind of institutional rebuilding that would be necessary to restore Venezuelan state capacity. That's not an accident. It's a strategic choice. A competent Venezuelan government might make independent decisions about oil exports, international partnerships, and regional relationships. A collapsed Venezuelan state that depends on external patrons for survival will make decisions that serve external interests rather than Venezuelan ones. The narcotics trade has filled the vacuum left by state collapse in ways that make recovery even more difficult. When legitimate economic activity becomes impossible because of infrastructure breakdown and institutional failure, illicit economic activity expands to fill the gap. Venezuela has become a major transit route for Colombian cocaine heading to North American and European markets, and that trade is controlled by networks that have no interest in state rebuilding or economic formalization. This creates parallel governance structures that are often more effective than official government institutions. Drug trafficking organizations can provide security, economic opportunities, and basic services in areas where the state can't or won't operate. They're not interested in political control over the whole country, but they are interested in maintaining territorial control over the specific areas that matter for their economic activities. The geography of drug trafficking routes overlaps extensively with the geography of oil infrastructure in eastern Venezuela. That's not a coincidence. Both activities require the same kinds of transportation networks, the same kinds of territorial control, and the same kinds of relationships with local populations. As state capacity has collapsed, the criminal organizations have essentially inherited control over much of Venezuela's economic infrastructure. The regional implications of Venezuelan state collapse extend far beyond refugee flows and narcotics trafficking. Brazil is discovering that having a failed state on your northern border creates security challenges that can't be managed through traditional diplomatic or military means. Colombia is dealing with spillover violence and economic disruption that affects border regions that were already struggling with their own internal conflicts. The Caribbean islands are seeing increased drug trafficking and migration flows that their small states simply can't handle. Trinidad and Tobago is particularly affected because of its geographic proximity and economic ties to Venezuela. The breakdown of Venezuelan economic activity has eliminated important trade relationships and created security challenges that Caribbean governments aren't equipped to address. This is what state collapse looks like in the modern world. It's not a dramatic military defeat or revolutionary overthrow. It's a gradual breakdown of institutional capacity that creates expanding zones of ungoverned territory and alternative economic systems. The official government continues to exist and maintain international recognition, but it gradually loses the ability to provide services, maintain infrastructure, or control territory. The international community doesn't have effective tools for dealing with this kind of collapse because it doesn't fit conventional models of state failure. Venezuela isn't at war, doesn't have competing governments claiming legitimacy, and hasn't formally renounced its international obligations. It's just slowly ceasing to function as a modern state while maintaining the legal and diplomatic forms of statehood. The Venezuelan military remains largely intact and loyal to the current government, but that doesn't translate into state capacity because the military can't operate oil infrastructure, provide electrical power, maintain water systems, or deliver medical services. Military control of territory doesn't create economic productivity or institutional effectiveness. What we're seeing is the difference between political power and state capacity. The Venezuelan government retains political power over the population that hasn't fled and the territory that isn't controlled by criminal organizations, but it lacks the state capacity to perform the basic functions of modern governance, which means political power becomes increasingly irrelevant for most practical purposes. The timeline for this collapse is being accelerated by climate change and global energy transitions that reduce long-term demand for Venezuelan oil. Even if Venezuela somehow restored its technical capacity to extract and export oil efficiently, the global market for petroleum products is going to be smaller and more competitive in the coming decades. Venezuela's oil is particularly heavy and requires significant refining to be commercially viable. As global oil demand peaks and begins to decline, refineries will prioritize lighter, cheaper crude oils that are easier to process. Venezuelan heavy crude will be among the first resources to become stranded assets as the global energy system transitions away from petroleum. This means that even successful political and economic reforms wouldn't restore Venezuela to its previous economic position. The window for oil-based development is closing, and Venezuela lacks the institutional capacity to manage a transition to alternative economic models while its current system is collapsing. The end result is that Venezuela is becoming a geographic expression rather than a functional country. The coastal regions will probably maintain some connection to international trade networks and Caribbean economic systems. The Western Highlands will probably become more integrated with Colombian economic networks, and the Amazon region will probably develop its own informal economic systems based on resource extraction and transit routes. None of these regions will be strong enough to reconstitute a unified Venezuelan state, and none of them have incentives to invest in the kind of institutional rebuilding that would be necessary to reverse the current collapse. The geographic logic that created Venezuela in the first place, administrative convenience during colonial expansion, no longer applies in a world where economic integration requires willing cooperation rather than imperial coercion. What I'm watching for is how quickly this transition accelerates and whether it happens through gradual fragmentation or more dramatic institutional breakdown. The current situation is unstable because it depends on external patrons maintaining their support for a government that can't deliver meaningful benefits to its own population. If Chinese or Russian support diminishes, if refugee flows create sufficient regional pressure for intervention, or if criminal organizations decide that formal political control would serve their interests better than informal territorial control, we could see much more rapid changes in Venezuelan political arrangements. But the underlying geographic and economic realities won't change regardless of what happens politically. Venezuela was a temporary creation of oil wealth and colonial boundaries, and oil wealth can't maintain state unity when geographic realities make economic integration difficult and institutional breakdown makes complex industrial activities impossible. We're not just watching the end of the Venezuelan government or the Venezuelan economy, we're watching the end of Venezuela as a coherent geographic and political entity. What comes next will probably be smaller, more economically rational, and more closely integrated with neighboring regions that actually make geographic and economic sense. Geography doesn't care about your national symbols or constitutional arrangements. Geography cares about transportation costs, resource distribution, and the feasibility of maintaining complex economic relationships across difficult terrain. Venezuelan geography never supported a unified state. Oil money made it possible to ignore that reality for about a century. The oil money is gone, and reality is reasserting itself. The beginning of Venezuela's end isn't the result of bad political choices or economic mismanagement, though there's been plenty of both. It's the result of geography finally overcoming the temporary financial arrangements that made an artificial country seem viable. Geography decides. Everything else is just a delay tactic. Venezuela is essentially three different countries accidentally stuck together by colonial administrative boundaries. You've got the Caribbean coastal strip where most people live, the Andean highlands that connect to Colombia, and the vast Amazon basin that connects to nothing useful. These regions don't naturally trade with each other, don't have complementary economies, and don't share transportation networks that make economic integration feasible. The only thing holding this geographic mess together for the past century has been oil money flowing from the eastern oil fields to Caracas, then getting redistributed through patronage networks to keep the various regions minimally functional. Take away that oil money, or more accurately, take away the ability to efficiently extract and export that oil, and there's no economic logic holding the country together.